March 9, 1972, Stateville Correctional Center, Illinois. Johnny Cash was mid-verse when he saw the glint of metal in the third row. A sharpened piece of steel, fashioned into a shank, was being passed between inmates during Cocaine Blues. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? The guards hadn't noticed yet, but Cash had. Frank Rivera, serving life for triple homicide, was 3 seats away from his sworn enemy Miguel Santos. The weapon was moving toward Rivera. Cash had seconds to decide: stop playing and alert the guards, risking a riot, or keep singing and watch a man die. Stateville was a fortress of circular cell houses, built on Jeremy Bentham's panopticon design. A place where everyone could be watched at all times. But on this day in the prison auditorium, the usual sightlines were blocked by 800 seated inmates, and something deadly was moving through the crowd unseen by the guards. Cash was 40 years old, dressed in his signature black, 7 years clean from pills, but still carrying the weight of his past. June was with him, standing stage left with the Carter sisters. Carl Perkins was on lead guitar. They'd played 23 prison concerts that year alone. But Stateville was different. The tension here was a living thing, thick as the humid March air that seeped through the barred windows. The problem had started 2 weeks earlier. Frank Rivera, leader of the Latin Kings inside Stateville, had testified in a closed hearing about guard corruption. His testimony had led to 3 guards being suspended. Word was that Miguel Santos, doing 25 for armed robbery, had made a deal with the remaining corrupt guards, kill Rivera, and get years shaved off his sentence through good behavior reports. But here's what nobody knew until now. Cash had been warned about this before the show. An inmate named Thomas Books Washington, the prison librarian, and one of the few men both gangs respected, had slipped a note to Cash's road manager during equipment setup. Blood will spill during Cocaine Blues. Third song, watch the third row. Cash had read the note backstage. June saw his face change. We should cancel, she said immediately. Can't do that, Cash replied. These men have been looking forward to this for months. Then tell the warden. Cash shook his head. If I tell the warden, they lock down the prison, punish everyone, and the violence just happens later, in the dark, where nobody can stop it. So Cash had made a different choice. He'd reorganized the set list, putting Cocaine Blues 3rd instead of 7th, hoping to control when the moment would come. He'd positioned himself at the front edge of the stage, closer to the audience than usual, where he could see everything. Now, as he sang about shooting his woman down, he watched the weapon move. It was a piece of metal bed frame, filed down over months, to a lethal point, wrapped in cloth at one end for a grip. It passed from Santos to another inmate, then another, moving inexorably toward Rivera, who sat unaware, actually enjoying the music, nodding his head to the rhythm. Cash made his decision. Without warning, he stopped playing. Just stopped. Mid-verse, mid-word. The sudden silence was jarring. Carl Perkins looked at him in confusion. June stepped forward, concerned. Hold on, Cash said into the microphone. Something's not right with my guitar. It was a lie, but it bought him seconds. Cash walked to the edge of the stage, pretending to tune his guitar, but his eyes were locked on the 3rd row. The weapon had stopped moving. The inmate holding it, a young kid maybe 20 years old, looked confused. The plan was disrupted. You know what, Cash said, still tuning his guitar. I want to try something different. Frank Rivera, you in here? Stop. What Cash did next had never been attempted in any prison before. Rivera's head snapped up. Surprised to hear his name, he raised his hand slowly. Suspicious. In prison, being singled out was usually bad. Come up here, Cash said. The auditorium went silent. Guards shifted nervously. Warden George Stamper, stood up from his seat in the back, ready to shut this down. "Mr. Cash," Rivera said carefully, "I don't think that's allowed." "Today it is," Cash replied, looking directly at the warden. "Trust me on this." Rivera stood slowly. He was 43, stocky, with prison tattoos covering his arms. As he moved toward the aisle, he had to pass directly in front of Santos and the inmates with the weapon. Cash spoke quickly. "Miguel Santos, you come up too." The tension in the room ratcheted up to breaking point. Everyone knew Rivera and Santos hated each other. Their gangs had been at war for 3 years, leaving 7 dead and dozens injured. Putting them together on stage seemed like insanity. Santos stood, his face unreadable. He was younger than Rivera, 31, lean and dangerous. As he moved to the aisle, Cash saw one of his crew palm the shank, hiding it. Both men walked toward the stage from opposite ends, like gunfighters approaching for a duel. The guards had their hands on their weapons. Inmates were holding their breath. June whispered urgently to Cash, "Johnny, what are you doing?" When both men reached the stage, they stood on opposite sides, refusing to look at each other. "Gentlemen," Cash said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I know you two have history, bad history, but right now, today, we're going to make different history." He pulled out 2 sets of maracas from behind an amplifier, simple instruments he sometimes gave to audience members. "We're going to play cocaine blues together," Cash announced. "All 3 of us, and we're going to show everyone in this room that music is stronger than hate." Rivera laughed bitterly. "You don't know what you're asking, Mr. Cash." "I know exactly what I'm asking," Cash replied. Then quieter, so only Rivera and Santos could hear. "I know about the knife. I know what was supposed to happen. And I'm giving you both a chance to walk away from it." Both men stiffened. Santos's hand instinctively went to his waist, checking for a weapon that wasn't there. Rivera's jaw clenched. "You set me up?" Rivera asked Santos. "You snitched on the guards," Santos replied. "They were selling drugs to kids in here." Rivera shot back. Cash stepped between them. "That's the past. Right now, you have a choice. You can go back to your seats, and what happens, happens. Or you can play these maracas for 1 song, show every man in this prison that there's another way." The most shocking moment was still to come. Warden Stamper had made his way to the stage. He was 62, a reformist who'd been trying to reduce violence at Stateville for 5 years with limited success. "Mr. Cash," he said, "I can't allow this. These men are Category A security risks." "Warden," Cash replied, "with all due respect, your way hasn't stopped the killing. Maybe it's time to try something else." Stamper looked at Rivera and Santos, then at the 800 inmates watching. He made a calculation. Stop this, and confirm that violence was inevitable, or let it play out, and maybe, just maybe, see something change. 5 minutes, he said. 1 song. Cash turned to Rivera and Santos. Rivera took the maracas first. "If I die for this," he said to Cash, "I'm haunting your ass." Santos took his pair. "This is crazy," he muttered. "The best things usually are," Cash replied. Cash started playing cocaine blues again, from the beginning. At first Rivera and Santos just stood there, holding the maracas like they were foreign objects. But as the song progressed, something shifted. Rivera started shaking them, just slightly, finding the rhythm. Santos followed, not to be outdone. By the second verse, both men were fully engaged, providing percussion for Cash's guitar. They still wouldn't look at each other, but they were creating music together. 800 inmates watched in amazement as 2 mortal enemies shared a stage. But here's the detail that changes everything. In the audience, the young inmate still had the shank. He was Santos's cousin, Ricardo Santos, doing 5 years for assault. He'd been ordered to pass the weapon to Rivera's killer. Now he watched his cousin on stage, making music with the intended victim. Ricardo stood up. Guards immediately moved toward him, but he raised his empty hands. Then, in full view of everyone, he pulled the wrapped shank from his waistband and let it fall to the floor with a metallic clatter that echoed through the auditorium. "No more," Ricardo said loudly. "If Miguel can stand up there with Rivera, then I'm done with this war." Another inmate stood up, one of Rivera's crew. He pulled out a different weapon, a sharpened toothbrush, and dropped it. Then another, and another. Within 30 seconds, the floor was littered with improvised weapons. Shanks, shivs, razor blades melted into plastic handles, even a few zip guns made from pipes and rubber bands. The guards were stunned. In 5 years at Stateville, Warden Stampar had never seen anything like it. Cash kept playing, but tears were running down his face. June was crying too. Even Carl Perkins, tough as nails, had to turn away to wipe his eyes. When the song ended, Rivera and Santos stood on stage, still holding the maracas. The auditorium was silent. Then Rivera did something unprecedented. He turned to Santos and extended his hand. "Truce," he said. Santos looked at the hand for a long moment. In prison, showing weakness could be fatal. Making peace with an enemy could be seen as betrayal by your own crew. "My cousin died in your gang's attack last year," Santos said. "My nephew died in yours," Rivera replied, hand still extended. Santos took his hand. They shook once firmly, and the auditorium exploded in applause. Not the polite applause of a concert audience, but the raw, emotional release of men who'd been living in fear and were suddenly seeing a possibility of peace. Wait, here's where the story takes an even more remarkable turn. Cash spoke into the microphone. "What just happened here? This is bigger than music. This is proof that men can change, that cycles can be broken." Rivera and Santos just showed more courage than most people show in a lifetime. He turned to the warden. "Sir, I have a request. These weapons on the floor, I'm betting there are more hidden in cells. What if you give these men 24 hours of amnesty? Let them turn in weapons without punishment. Start fresh." Stampar looked at the weapons scattered on the floor, at the 2 gang leaders on stage, at the 800 inmates who seemed to be holding their breath. "Mr. Rivera, Mr. Santos," the warden said, "if I do this, will you guarantee the peace?" Rivera and Santos looked at each other, then nodded. 24 hours, Stampar announced. "Turn in all weapons to the chaplain's office. No questions asked, no punishment. After that, we go back to regular rules." What happened over the next 24 hours became legend in the Illinois correctional system. Over 3,000 weapons were turned in. Knives made from bed frames, glass, plastic, metal food trays, zip guns that could fire one shot, garrotes made from guitar strings. The chaplain's office looked like a medieval armory. But more importantly, Rivera and Santos met that night in the library. With Books Washington mediating, they hammered out a peace agreement between their gangs. No more attacks. Disputes would be settled through basketball games or rap battles, not violence. The peace held for 8 months, a lifetime in prison terms, until Santos was transferred to another facility. But even after he left, the violence never returned to its previous levels. Here's what you don't know about the aftermath. 3 weeks after the concert, Cash received a letter from Ricardo Santos, the young inmate who first dropped his weapon. "Mr. Cash, I was supposed to kill a man that day. Been planning it for months. Had myself psyched up for it. But when I saw my cousin up there with Rivera, making music instead of war, something broke in me. Not my anger. That's still there. But my belief that violence was the only way. You didn't just stop a murder that day. You stopped me from becoming a murderer. That's a debt I can't repay. But I promise you this. When I get out in 3 years, I'm going to counsel kids away from gang life. I'm going to tell them about the day Johnny Cash turned killers into musicians. Ricardo kept that promise. After his release in 1975, he founded a youth intervention program in Chicago that has prevented hundreds of kids from joining gangs. Frank Rivera served another 15 years. During that time, he earned his GED, then a bachelor's degree in sociology through correspondence courses. After his release in 1987, he became a gang intervention specialist for the Chicago Police Department, using his credibility to negotiate truces between street gangs. Miguel Santos was less fortunate. Transferred to Menard Correctional Center, he was killed in 1974 by members of his own gang who saw his peace with Rivera as betrayal. But before he died, he managed to send one last message to Rivera through the prison network. The music was worth it. Cash himself was profoundly changed by that day. In his autobiography, he wrote, March 9, 1972, Stateville Prison. I went there to sing songs. Instead, I witnessed a miracle. 2 men who had every reason to kill each other chose to make music instead. In all my years of performing, I've never felt the power of music more strongly than when those maracas started shaking. It proved something I'd always believed, but never seen so clearly, that music can literally save lives. The guitar Cash played that day was donated to Stateville's music program, which was established after the concert. The warden, inspired by what he'd witnessed, created spaces for inmates to learn instruments, form bands, and express themselves through music rather than violence. Brooks Washington, the librarian who'd warned Cash about the planned attack, became the program's first director. He taught hundreds of inmates to play guitar, using Cash's donated instrument. Many of those men credit music with saving them from the cycle of violence. In 1982, 10 years after the concert, Stateville hosted a reunion. Cash returned to perform, and this time, the opening act was a band of inmates who'd learned to play through the music program. Their name, the Peacemakers. Frank Rivera was in the audience, just months from release. He stood up during the performance and spoke. Mr. Cash, 10 years ago, you put maracas in my hands when those hands were ready to kill. You showed me they could create instead of destroy. Every man who's found music instead of violence in this place owes that to what you started that day. But the most remarkable detail emerged only recently, in 2019, when Stateville's old records were digitized. Large reports from March 9, 1972, describe a different version of events. Minor disturbance during concert. Several contraband items voluntarily surrendered. Performance continued without major incident. No mention of the weapons on the floor. No mention of gang leaders on stage. No mention of the peace treaty. The official record sanitized one of the most extraordinary moments in prison history. But the truth lived on, in the men who were there. Thomas Brooks Washington, now 91, and living in a Chicago nursing home, still has the original note he passed to Cash, warning about the violence. On the back, Cash had written, "Books, thank you for trusting me with the truth. Music won today. J.C." In 2020, a documentary filmmaker tracked down 47 men who were in the audience that day. Every single one, without exception, said it was the moment that changed their understanding of what was possible in prison. Several credit it with their eventual redemption. One former inmate, now a minister, said, "I'd seen men die in prison, I'd seen them kill, but I'd never seen them choose peace when violence was easier." Cash didn't just play music that day. He conducted an exorcism of our demons. The maracas, those simple, cheap instruments that Cash handed to Rivera and Santos, are now in the Illinois State Historical Society. They're displayed with a simple placard, "Instruments of Peace, Stateville, 1972." But the real memorial to that day isn't in a museum. It's in every gang intervention program that uses music to reach kids. It's in every prison that has a music room. It's in every moment when someone chooses creation over destruction. Warden George Stampar, who retired in 1978, kept a photo on his desk for the rest of his life. Cash on stage with Rivera and Santos, all three making music. He would show it to new guards and say, "This is what's possible when you treat inmates as human beings capable of change." I ran Stateville for 8 years. We tried everything: isolation, punishment, rewards. But nothing reduced violence like the day Johnny Cash put Maracas in the hands of enemies and asked them to keep time together. June Carter Cash, in a rare interview about prison concerts, said, "Johnny faced down death many times. Addiction, depression, his own demons. But he said the bravest thing he ever did was stand between those two gang leaders at Stateville and bet their humanity was stronger than their hate. When those weapons hit the floor, when those men started turning them in, Johnny fell to his knees backstage and prayed. He knew he'd witnessed something sacred." The last surviving witness to the complete event is Carl Perkins' son Stan, who was working as a roadie that day. In 2023, he recalled, "When that first weapon hit the floor, the sound echoed through the whole auditorium. Then another, then dozens. It sounded like hail on a tin roof. But it wasn't destruction. It was men choosing to disarm themselves." Dad said later, "It was like watching swords being beaten into plowshares, except they were shanks being dropped for Maracas." Cash performed at Stateville 2 more times before his death in 2003. Each time, he played cocaine blues with guest musicians from the inmate population. The song that was supposed to soundtrack a murder became instead an anthem of peace. In his final performance there in 1996, Cash spoke to the inmates. 24 years ago, in this room, you taught me that enemies can become allies, that weapons can become instruments, that killers can become protectors. You showed me that redemption isn't a word, it's an action. It's choosing peace when violence is easier. It's dropping the knife and picking up the maracas." He paused, his voice breaking with age and emotion. "I've played for presidents and kings. I've played in the greatest venues in the world. But nothing compared to the day I played here and watched 800 condemned men choose hope over hate. You didn't just change your lives that day, you changed mine." Frank Rivera was there for that final performance, now a free man, a grandfather, a respected voice in criminal justice reform. After Cash finished speaking, Rivera stood and led the room in something unprecedented. 800 voices, singing Amazing Graces, a cappella, no instruments, just human voices raised in harmony, where once there had been only anger. Cash stood on stage, tears streaming down his face, as the men he'd once saved from violence now sang to him about grace. When the song ended, Cash spoke his final words to Stateville. "The knife that was meant to kill became the key that unlocked peace. Remember that. In your darkest moments, when violence seems like the only answer, remember that 2 enemies once stood on this stage and made music together. If they could do that, anything is possible." The concert program from March 9, 1972, signed by Cash, Rivera, and Santos, sold at auction in 2021 for $450,000. The buyer donated it back to Stateville, where it hangs in the music room that exists because of that day. Below it is a plaque with a quote from Johnny Cash: "Music can't stop a bullet, but it can stop the hand that pulls the trigger." On March 9, 1972, it stopped dozens of hands, and in doing so, it proved that even in the hardest of places, among the most hardened of men, redemption is possible. The knife became maracas. Enemies became allies. A concert became a conversion. And Johnny Cash proved that sometimes the greatest courage isn't facing danger. It's believing in the possibility of peace and betting everything on it. That's the story of the day music stopped a murder at Stateville, the day weapons fell like rain, the day Johnny Cash conducted not just a concert, but a transformation. Now you know what really happened when the man in black stood between killers and told them to make music instead.